Good morning. We're back with Dollars and Cents. On the previous segment, we got into inflation. We were talking about what inflation was, what the CPI index is, and how there's a different CPI index depending on who you are and what age you're at. Obviously, what we were talking about earlier was depending on what stage you are in your life, you spend money differently. So as you get older, you might spend more money on medical care versus when you're younger. When you're younger, you might spend more money on housing because when you're older, you might have a mortgage that's paid off. But Rob, you were talking to us about the different CPI indexes. So why don't you take it away?
Correct. We all kind of follow the regular CPI or CPI for W, but there is a CPI or Consumer Price Index for the elder. And it's basically rebalances some of that basket to be more accurate to what an older retired person might be going through. And so, we have clothing, that's about the same, education's the same, recreation's the same. Medical care, in that basket, medical care is really almost twice as expensive per year for an elder as it is for a normal person. So we think that's important. Normal CPI doesn't really cover that. Food, actually, the elder is actually eating less. Retirees have a tendency to, not consume as much food as a younger person. Transportation, sometimes transportation is actually lower for the elder, but where it really gets hit is housing. A lot of people, as medical care allows them to live longer, assisted living, having people living with them, having to go into special places for helping them as they do get older, that's a lot more expensive. And it's usually, medical care is about twice as high as the normal CPI on the CPIE, and then housing is about 20 to 25% higher for the elder compared to the CPI. I point that out because when it comes time for Social Security to decide what the cost of living adjustment is going to be, right now they're still looking at the CPI for the worker, which isn't really as accurate pertaining to what an older person who's retired or the elder might actually be experiencing.
Yeah, because they're just spending their money differently. The portion of their income they probably have to spend a little bit more on prescription and drugs and doctor's visits. So that makes sense that's a higher that's a higher percentage. The other thing that we wanted to get into is the numbers. I know over the last couple months they've been throwing out some inflation numbers. Like for example, May inflation was up 8.6, June was up 9.1, July was up 8.5, and August was up 8.3. What does that mean? Does that mean that from May to June, everything got 9.1% more expensive, and then from June to July, everything got another 8.5% expensive? No, that's not what it means. Those numbers are yearly numbers. So in order to understand those, from May to June, things didn't get 9.1% more expensive. From June of 2021 to June of 2022, things got 9.1% more expensive. And then from July of 2021 to July of 2022, things got 8.5% more expensive. So those numbers are looking back, gauging off of a year ago. They're not going off of the previous month. That's important to understand because that can be very scary if you're thinking that, hey, from month to month, things are getting close to 10% more expensive.
Right.
They are looking back over the last year.
One thing to keep in mind when you look at those numbers, the reason that it kind of skewed up and then came back down is if you compare the cost of gas a year ago, we had a huge spike in gas prices going into June. And it reflected in June much higher than it was June a while back. Gas prices came down, and then we see the trend occurring. So like you said, comparing this month to a year ago, June was the month in which gas prices jumped up dramatically.
Exactly. And with gas only being a fraction of the CPI or a portion of the CPI, you can see how those numbers only adjusted kind of, 0.5%. That's still a good amount, but still, it only adjusted by about 0.5%. And then the other thing that we wanted to talk about is what about interest rates compared to inflation? The Fed's starting to rise interest rates. Why is that? What does that have to do with inflation? Well, what inflation is obviously it's a loss of purchasing power. And what the Fed does is the Fed actually controls what interest rates are. So, for example, whenever the Fed increases interest rates, that's going to trickle down to you and businesses. So something that you've probably seen is as interest rates start to go up, things like mortgages, car loans, possibly even student loans, business loans, those have gotten a lot more expensive. It used to be that you could get a mortgage for about 3%, Now you're having to spend almost 7% to get a mortgage. So what does this do, and how does this help combat inflation? Well, whenever interest rates are really cheap and really low, you can borrow money really cheaply. You're a business and you want to take on a business loan. As long as the ROI is above 1 or 2%, whatever the interest rate is, you can take on that loan. So now you can take on a ton of different projects. Or if you're an individual person, you can now possibly buy multiple different homes because borrowing money is so cheap. Well, whenever borrowing money is cheap like that, and easy to do, a lot of people do it, and vastly increases the money supply. Whenever the money supply gets bigger, each individual dollar loses purchasing power, right? Because there's more in the system, supply and demand. Whenever they raise interest rates, those interest rates then trickle down to us, and it becomes more expensive to borrow money. Whenever it becomes more expensive to borrow money, you're probably not going to do it as much, and that's going to shrink the money supply, or at least help stable it out. So that's kind of that relationship in between interest rates and inflation, and that's why they've been raising interest rates, and that's how it helps combat inflation in theory. But we wanted to get into what are some of the pros and some of the cons of inflation. We're going to start with the pros, and some of these might surprise you. First pro is newly issued bonds. So you take a look at the yield on the new bonds. They're going to be significantly higher than the old ones. You go back maybe even a year ago, you look at the yield on a bond, what they're sitting in between 1% and 2%, 1% and 3%.
Yield keeping up with inflation.
Yeah, not even keeping up with inflation. And so now, as you start to see the new bonds getting pushed out, those have a higher yield. Those are closer to 4 or 5. So as interest rates start to rise, you're going to see the yields on bonds get higher, and if you hold them till maturity, they're going to have a better return. Now, obviously, as interest rates continue to increase, that is going to hurt bonds. But if you just take a look at the yield from bonds, a couple of years ago versus the yield of bonds now, the yield is significantly higher now, and that's because of those interest rates increase. Another pro is if you have fixed rate debt. So if you have a fixed rate car loan, fixed rate mortgage, those are all going to get cheaper as inflation continues to tick up. So let's say that you have a 30-year mortgage, right? Going back to the example of buying a gallon of gas with a nickel, let's say you have a mortgage, and let's say your mortgage is $1,000 or $2,000 a year. Well, that might seem expensive now, but 30 years down the road, as inflation starts to take hold, that $1,000 is going to lose its purchasing power. It's not going to necessarily be as valuable, but you're still going to be paying the same exact dollar amount for the asset. So it's going to get cheaper over time. It's almost like if you were to go to the gas station back 30 years ago and you'd tell them, hey, listen, I want to pay, $1 for a gallon of gas for the next 30 years. And they agreed to it. Right off the bat, that's going to seem kind of silly because that's what everyone's paying. But 30 years later, if you were paying $1 for a gallon of gas now, you would look like a genius. So that's one of the pros. Another pro is Social Security. And Rob, I know you got some numbers and some things to talk about on that.
Definitely. So as we see interest rates going up and obviously inflation going up, Social Security usually will try to trend every year and do a cost of living adjustment. So we're looking at a healthy 8.5% that will be an increase in Social Security. And that's a big number. If we look at some of the other years of what they did, we were up 6 last year, which was a pretty healthy number. Hadn't seen anything quite like that since the 80s. 1980, 1981, cost of living adjustments were almost 11%. So we're going to see a very large cost of living adjustment on Social Security. And what's also going to be kind of nice is Medicare, which is the expense for Part B premiums that will come out to cover the doctor portion if you're on Medicare. The actual cost per month is going to go down. Last year they raised it pretty dramatically in anticipation of a couple of drugs that were coming out. Those drugs turned out to not be as expensive, and so that they're going to adjust it so that the cost of Medicare will actually go down. So you get a cost of living adjustment, you get a decrease in Medicare. It's a pretty pleasant year for Social Security overall. Again, we can reference that CPI chart. We would like to see a higher increase for people on Social Security. We're still behind where we should be in keeping up with true inflation over multiple years. But we'll take what we can get whenever we can get it.
And whenever we come back, if you're not retired or on Social Security, we have a benefit for you as well in dollars and cents.